Welcome back to the show podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Indestructible Souls, Mental Wellness for African American Men and Boys. We're back. It is June 6th. We're at the beginning of summertime. School's getting out. Kids will hopefully no longer have to deal with, what is that called? Will no longer have to deal with distant learning and so forth. So today's show, I have a co-host that I'm going to bring on in a minute, and we're going to talk about, the title of the show is The Truth About Video Games. So this is Indestructible Souls, and today we're going to talk about, are video games ruining our children? I've been teasing this show for quite a while, simply because I see a lot of kids in my practice. And when I say kids, they all kids to me, but I'm talking school-age kids, anywhere from as young as 3, 4, all the way up to adolescents coming out of high school. And a lot of times parents bring their children into therapy because they're saying they're depressed, they're anxious. They stay in their room all the time, and a whole bunch of things. And the common denominator, since I've started doing therapy, the common denominator has been excessive video game play. And so I don't want to bash people for video games, but I want to give you some truth. And so a lot of parents believe that they are doing their kids a service and showing their kids that they love them by giving them the latest and the greatest video games. And then also, there's another factor that we'll get into, is it's a pastime, but as long as my kids are playing video games and they're good and they're happy, I can do my thing. We're going to talk about that. However, before we get into the show, I want to plug a couple of things. You can check me out at Beauregard Therapy, located in Colton, California. You can reach me at Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Psychology Today, and so forth. And then also, every Wednesday night, let's see, I meant to update the flyer, but I guess I didn't. Every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, you can check me out along with my partner, Jerome Washington, for our men's group, Hearts of Men, Mental Wellness Group for African American Men, moving forward together. That's every Wednesday night. You can sign up on Eventbrite, or you can email us at heartsofmen@Beauregard Therapy and sign up for the group. It is growing. You won't want to miss it. It is a safe space for African American men, Black men, to talk about the things that concern us on a weekly basis. And then also coming up, our group has been asked to join with the Sister Circle's Father's Day edition, and that is Saturday morning, June 26th at 9 a.m. And you can also sign up for that Eventbrite, where the women's group is going to join with the men's group, and we're going to have a very powerful discussion. So without further ado, I want to get into the topic of, are video games ruining our kids, ruining our children? So I'm going to bring in I don't even want to call him a special guest, because we are partners. We work together. He's also a therapist out of Florida, and we're currently at the final stages of development of our group practice. We are going to be bi-coastal, and we're going to build a system. We're going to build a therapy group that is going to be very powerful. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on my partner, Jerome Washington. What's going on, young man?
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Mr. Borger. I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
All
Glad
right.
to be on.
All right. So your sound is loud, so I don't know if it's just me, but we're going to go with it. So
Okay.
today, we're going to talk about, are video games ruining our children? And that's that could be a strong statement, especially in the video game age, where a lot of our kids, that's all they do, or
Mhm.
that's the thing to do. And we're going to talk mostly about video games today, but I'm talking video games, YouTube, excessive screen time, and so forth. So to get this topic started, you've been practicing therapy for how long?
Just about approximately 25 years,
So you've been in practice for 25 years. I've been
give or
working
take a
with
few.
okay.
I'm getting old. I
I've been
can't remember these days.
right. So I've been working with kids quite well in therapy, not quite as long. However, I've been working with people for quite a while. So 25 years ago, video games weren't as prevalent.
Right.
But as video games became more popular, as kids become more excessive and more obsessed with video games, what have you begun to see?
Well, one thing I can say I begin to see is just kids beginning to isolate themselves more towards the video games and away from just socialization, period, with other people.
Okay. So and we're going to talk about those effects and how not only the isolation and the other things that it creates. So what I would like to do is we're just going to kind of go back and forth. What we're going to talk about today is the effects of, and I want to qualify this. Video games aren't inherently evil. They're not inherently bad. They're a good hobby to have.
Hmm.
They they do provide some what's the word I'm looking for? They do provide some good things. However, I'm talking excessive and addictive video games being a lot of kids do, or a lot of kids begin to suffer from. So let's get into the discussion. And I'll talk about what I begin to see in my practice. A lot of times, the common denominator when kids come to me, or where parents bring their kids, and I'm talking that full range, adolescent, meaning early adulthood, 16, 17, 18, sometimes older, but early as elementary school, 6 years old, 5 years old, seven, eight, through that whole spectrum. And they come and they have a list of concerns. For one, they anxiety, angry outbursts, um, isolating, and so forth. And so they say, well, something's wrong with my kid. And when I do all the assessing and I assess the kid and I assess the family, the common denominator for, I want to say at this point, almost 100% of the time is excessive video game. What do you say to that?
I mean, once you do the study with it, I mean, I'm pretty sure it shows itself in some way, shape, or form. I mean, whenever you're dealing with adolescents like 16, 17 on down, uh, like we talked about at the top of the show, a lot of these kids get so entrenched in these things that it takes over so much of their lives and their personalities. That stuff ends up coming out in terms of how they relate to their parents, how it affects them with school, and then they end up having trouble at school, which translates into trouble at home. Trouble at home translates into trouble at school. Then they end up coming to therapy, and like you said, once you do the assessments, it all comes out. The bottom line often is some use of video games, and if it's excessive, you often have those issues.
What do you consider, when you talk about excessive? What do you consider excessive?
I mean, I would consider excessive. You're talking, I don't know, 6, 7 hours a day, every day. Uh, they will miss school. They'll come straight home from school to play. It's constantly on the phone. It's constantly on the weekends, all day on the weekends. It's after school. That I would consider to be excessive.
Okay, so what I begin when we talk excess, whether it's all night long, it's 6, 7, 8 hours a day, it's a lot of those things. And
Actually, in lieu of family time as well.
right, it takes the place of family time. So
Hmm.
here, do me a favor. Do me a favor. I don't know if it's the. Can you turn your volume down a little bit? Because I'm getting some feedback, and I don't know if it's coming out on the video or if it's just in my headset.
Okay, I just turned it down a little bit now. Is that better?
Yeah. Hopefully it doesn't come out on the thing, but we're going to work with it.
Okay.
So we're going to get into. We got 10 things that happen with kids when we talk about excessive video game play, and we're going to get into that when we talk about the family time, the isolation, the effects it has on the brain, and so forth. So the first thing, and we'll both talk about this, but let's talk about what we call as the dopamine addiction. Talk about how video game plays has a physical effect on our kids' brains. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, biologically, when you look at it, dopamine actually can be in contrast to or actually mimic the use of cocaine, the effects and the ramifications of cocaine. So when an individual is playing long hours of video games, it's very similar to taking and using cocaine, which elevates the dopamine in the system, which will also trigger the neurons and the neuropses to fire off a lot faster than usual, which can actually incite individuals, get a mood elevated, have people frustrated. They can act out. You can have heart palpitations. Those kinds of things can end up happening if that takes place.
So when we talk about having a dopamine addiction and video games have this effect, and so our kids who are literally on video games excessively, we can almost equate that to them being constantly fed some type of a drug continuously, day by day, every day, which dopamine is what we call the reward
Hmm.
system of the brain. So they're
Correct.
constantly being fed this what we call the reward system, which is equivalent to cocaine or something like that. What happens when that's taken away?
Well, when that's taken away, it's very similar to the loss of the drug. An individual will go through some sort of withdrawal, some sort of decline in that hormone, which would cause the opposite effect in an individual. So instead of them being on the high end, they may circle back and become more on the low end, but more agitated, probably isolate, still become irritable, just for the fact of what's very similar to what's called relapse.
And so if you ever dealt with somebody with substance abuse and you talk about withdrawal, would you say
Hmm.
this is equivalent to going through withdrawal, being irritable, angry? And I've seen kids to the point where they want to fight, where they'll break things, they'll steal things, and they'll do what we call dope fiend behaviors to get to the video game. What do you say?
Agreed. Agreed. I mean, you'll see that a lot in young kids, ranging from probably 7 up to about 12 or 13. They'll act
Right.
out. They'll do things like that.
And so what happens is when we're constantly well, let me add this caveat.
Okay.
What people don't understand is that the brain is not fully developed until the age 25, right? 24, 25. And so when we're adding things that's going to negatively affect brain development, what does that ultimately produce in terms of behavior, emotions, and mentally? What are the effects that has?
Well, you have a lack of development, so you have a deficiency in those areas. One of the major aspects of the brain that isn't developed at that time is the frontal lobe. And when it comes to the frontal lobe, that's where the reasoning is. So also when you add in the emotional deficits with the difficulty reasoning, you're going to have someone who's just not able to actually basically control and monitor their emotions on a consistent basis,
Right.
as well as thought and reason consistently on a positive basis, not in a negative sense.
So when we talk about dopamine addiction, when we talk about excessive video games, and we're not going to belabor the point, I really want people to do their research,
Mm-hmm.
is excessive video game play not only can be addictive, but it has the same brain activity if somebody's being on drugs.
Very true.
Absolutely.
Very true. Mm-hmm.
Next thing that I want to talk about, because I really want parents and understand this. This isn't something that's in theory. This is something that me and you both see. And when we talk about, especially in this day and age, when we add in the COVID, when we add in distant learning, is the reduction in motivation. It's funny because I see older children and teenagers literally have the lack of motivation to do much of anything. And one of the things that I see personally is that those things that used to have meaning as a young kid, those things that used to have meaning as a young boy, there's no longer motivation to work for things. There's no
Correct.
longer motivation to achieve things. There's no longer motivation to delay gratification to gain rewards. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, when you take away the aspect like you're talking about of gratification and you delay it, individuals with this reduction in motivation, when you delay that gratification and they have a reduction in motivation, they're not even going to strive for anything, because everything when it comes to the dopamine and when you're talking about this topic of video games, it's instant gratification along with the dopamine component. So anything I want to achieve as a kid, I get right here, right now, above board, which means more than usual. So I can sit here and just indulge myself. Now, when you take it away, I start to decline. When I continue to decline, continue to decline, I end up falling behind.
Right.
Okay.
And I also believe that it kills resiliency because, like you said, it's instant gratification, but the world doesn't react to people that way. Everything
Well,
is instant.
of course not. Well, the world is definitely not like it was when we were kids. So when you talk about resiliency and you combine that with reduction in motivation, resiliency is an individual's ability to maintain and work through things and persevere. If I take away your motivation, resiliency is the last thing you're gonna have.
Right.
You're not gonna have motivation to try to make it through anything. You're not gonna be motivated to do pretty much of nothing.
Right. And so what I see is I see, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, is poor health, poor
Mm-hmm.
hygiene,
Mm-hmm.
really not wanting to do anything outside of video game, and everything else loses its luster, everything else loses its appeal because I don't want to do that because I just want to be on video games, even social skills because, and we'll get into this more later, to
Yeah.
even want to meet people and make friends and make new friends and things like that.
No,
What do you say?
I completely agree with what you're saying. Actually, if you look at what you're saying, when it comes down to contrasting social skills and all the other components of life with the video games, that's instant gratification. When you talk about going to school, doing chores, having a job, making friends, that takes initiative and that takes a quick pro quo. That takes me giving something to someone, an adolescent has to give something to someone and put themselves out there to be able to engage in conversation or socialize. But in order to even do that, you have to have the desire to want to do that. But there's no instant gratification for you to do that. It's bilateral. They're going to gratify and you're gratified.
Not only that, you can't push buttons to make people do what you want them to do.
There's the lack of said. That's the lack of instant gratification. So when you have to create gratification, that you don't have motivation to do that because it's not given to you. See, when you turn on a video game system, everything is right there at your hands. When you have to go out and get yourself motivated to go hang out with a friend or meet a friend or go to work, it doesn't instantly gratify. You have to work 2 weeks to get a paycheck.
Right. Not to mention it takes work to get up, take a shower,
Correct.
put on clean clothes, to do your chores, to do
Mm-hmm.
all of these things that are normal human functions. But
Mm-hmm.
now, if I could roll out of bed in my same clothes I slept in and grab a Hot Pocket and eat candy and drink Kool-Aid all day and have nothing to do, and if it's been okay for me to do that, nothing else motivates me. Not even money.
No, I agree. I agree. I think, just to piggyback on what you're saying, that nothing motivates you, not even money. The one thing they will try to achieve is another way. They'll find another route.
Explain
And
that.
what I mean by that is, if I can't have my video games and I can't achieve my needs that way, but I have to have money to do something, they'll find another way. And that's usually, I don't want to say negative. It won't be the most positive of efforts. Some kids in these positions often allude to stealing. They allude to, taking money out of their parents' purse,
Right.
lifting money out of schools. Yeah, and once you break into that habit, again, let's go back to where we started this premise in the first place. We have cocaine and dopamine. So when we go back there,
Billing out of
now you have an addict.
right.
Now you have an addict who's not on drugs, he's on video games. Now I'm not here to say all video games, like you said, are bad. It's just when you have this in an excessive amount, individuals want to gratify when they want to be gratified. So if that's not possible, they're going to try to either make that happen or they're going to act out in some kind of way because they can't get their needs met because they don't.
Right. So let's begin to get more of the mental aspect. And I don't think parents realize it because it happens so gradually. By the time they come to me, their kids are talking suicide. They're talking self-harm. Nobody loves me. I have no friends. But they get to a point where they're so depressed that then when they have the video game, they begin to the emotions begin to get out of whack. So let's talk about the emotional suppression that happens.
Okay.
Talk about it for a minute.
Well, that goes right back to when you talk about social skills. Adolescents have to learn basically from their parents. All human beings learn from their parents first off. Those
Correct.
are the first two people you see, or the first individual you see when you're born. You learn all your habits, your social skills, your reasoning, your how to talk, how to walk. You learn all those things from your parents. So as you grow up and you drift toward that side of the fence, so to speak, as your parents, then you learn that skill set. If you isolate yourself away to a video game, which is something that is already scripted, it can't go outside a certain limit in the box, so to speak. Also, it's not giving you an interaction. You are interacting with it, but it's not interacting with you. And
Right.
when it's triggering that dopamine and setting you off in that way, you're not regulating emotions in a social sense. You're regulating emotions in conjunction with a video game or something that is depicted to give you back a certain reaction. This is not a contrast in different personality styles.
And not even experiencing the full range of emotions
Well, no. When
for
you're playing
development.
video games, yeah, when you're playing video games, you're gonna get a certain range. You're gonna get, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm scared. This is
Amen.
funny. You're gonna get something like that. So when you're dealing with that, that's the range of your emotions. Now, when you take that away, or when there's deficit, you don't have a subsequently adequate level of emotionality. Therefore, when
Right.
you don't have emotionality, or you have a poor way of allocating it, so to speak, then you just become numb, or you
Right.
become an individual who poorly can express their emotions inappropriately or inadequately.
I can't tell you how many young boys come to me, and I once again young, that full
Mm-hmm.
range, that do not have or know how to express emotion. They stick to the script of I'm depressed. I don't know why I'm depressed. I'm anxious. I don't know why I'm anxious. Or it becomes I don't know what I feel. But when that dopamine or when that video game's taken away, most of the time it come out in depression, irritability, anger, and those things that are maladaptive for
Correct.
proper functioning.
Correct. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've worked for years in hospitals and detoxes where I've seen people come in from cocaine or meth or heroin, which is mixed with fentanyl. And when they go through that detox process, they almost mimic individuals that you're talking about. They can't reason. They can't talk to people. They get in the fights over the smallest of things, like somebody took my book or somebody took my socks. in the hospital. So you see these exact behaviors that you're talking about.
Right.
But when it
So
happens in an adolescent, they don't have that rationale. They don't have those social skills that can say, look, let me just walk away from this, or let me let somebody know before I have to go off or yell at somebody about something. They don't do that. They don't have those skills.
right. Well, they have them, but they lose them. Or if they
Yeah. Okay.
or
Well, they're
well,
underdeveloped. They're underdeveloped.
we'll go with
Let's
underdeveloped.
say that they're underdeveloped.
So emotional suppression, to where we are emotional beings,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to be able to be emotional literate to experience, manage, and regulate the full range of emotions. But
Right.
then now here we have a generation whose emotional development is being suppressed.
Yeah, you got it. That's
So
about the stake of it.
so here's that I think it's obvious, but maybe not so obvious, is the stress, the physical stress, negative stress, also the health risk. One of the things we talk about is when we talk about the health risk, poor diet, poor hygiene, being sitting in one place at one time, the lack of exercise, the lack of sunlight, the lack of exposure to other things. Talk about that for a little bit.
Well, when you talk about sitting for a while, or what we call being sedentary, being sedentary when you're old, that's something that most people experience when they're like an old age home. When you're an adolescent and you're sedentary and you're in a room maybe with the lights dim, like you said, you're not going to get hungry, you're not going to get thirsty, you're not going to get fatigued. So therefore, your appetite and your metabolism isn't working the way they naturally should. So you'll often have. I mean, I'm not sure if you have patients like this, but I have. I'll have adolescents come to me. Some are either overweight or some are very underweight,
Right.
and that's
I've
because
had both. I've had
yes,
both.
yes, that's because they're pacifying those needs by either overeating or undereating because the
Right.
body's not moving, so their metabolism isn't going the way it naturally would if you were out riding a bike, skateboarding, swimming at friend's house, or doing whatever. You don't have those polarities. So that's some of the somatic symptomology that I've seen over time with this same population.
Right. And so when we're talking, and that's just it, is I see a lot of kids, and particularly boys, girls play video games too, but I
Mm-hmm.
think the problem is more prevalent with boys or young men, and the health risk, the lack of sunshine, the lack of exercise. And even when we talk about just being around people and that emotional relief and that, how could I put it, that social feedback that people don't get. So now I don't have friends, or their only friends are people they never even met. So
Online,
understand that a part of our mental and emotional well-being is the feedback we get from people,
right,
the feedback we get from being around people.
right.
And so these are just the health risk upon health risk. Now let's transition to this. We talked about this, but we could talk about it more specifically in terms of poor mental health, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, uh,
Shoot, anger outbursts,
the anger, the
poor
being
emotional control. Yeah.
irritability, the lack of emotional control. Talk about some of those things.
Oh, I mean, that when you get into this realm, it really becomes prominent because a lot of these individuals don't even realize that a lot of the video games they play, if it's excessive, is often with peers online. A lot of people play online, and it's not bad if it's not excessive, but if it gets to be an excessive amount, like you said, your friends are online, so you don't have the ability to socialize with somebody interpersonally, face to face, and learn skill sets that way. So if you're trying to develop a mindset of maybe going to school and finishing school, or you got goals in this or goals in that, that's going to be difficult to do with that mindset. So that ends up charting out to be you lose motivation, like you said, you become depressed, or you're anxious socially and you don't talk to people much. So now
You
you
know,
start to think, hey, maybe they don't like me, or maybe I don't fit
right.
in. So now you start to beat up yourself due to the
Right.
actual circumstances that are beating you up as well. So now this could lead to depression. This could lead to social isolation. This could lead
Self-loathing.
to correct. This could lead to a plethora of adjustment disorders. So when we come into that realm, individuals don't really realize they're setting themselves up for mental health issues by isolating.
Right. And it's funny you mentioned, because I see this a lot. Kids come to me and they say, well, I'm depressed or I'm anxious about school. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what my future is going to look like.
Yep.
I don't know, am I going to be successful at school, and all those things. So my question is, tell me, why do you feel that way? Well, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada.
Right.
The problem is they're trying to figure out how to achieve these tall tasks, these
Mm-hmm.
large goals,
Mm-hmm.
but how do I get to play video games 8-10 hours a day? Well, if you're in college, can you? Right? And so
That's be difficult.
that things become that self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, I don't have any friends. I don't know how to socialize. Well, when was the last time, and we're talking pre-COVID, when was the last time you went out and engaged with people? Well, I don't. I play video games. Then I'll play video games, and then I'll try to study. Then I'll try to complete this paper. Then I tell myself I can't do it. I'm not smart enough. But you're not taking away one of the major factors that's keeping you from reaching your goals. Then that negative self-talk starts. Then here comes the mental health issue.
Right. No,
Here
you're
comes
right.
here comes the depression. So
Mm-hmm.
almost like what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy based off of your actions.
Right. Right. And to piggyback on that, when you look at the self-fulfilling prophecy of piggybacking off of your own actions, that's going to become a cyclical effect, which means you don't reach out, so it breaks you down. And since you're broken down, you don't reach out. And since you don't reach out, you get further broken down, and it continues and it continues and it continues. I
Right.
actually, not too long ago, worked with an individual. He's 25 years old. Last time I had him, he's 25 years old. Got into video games when he was about 16, 17. Was anxious, started playing online with friends, almost dropped out of school, started using marijuana and other drugs. He's 25 now, just got his first job pretty much not too long ago, and is learning how to socialize.
Right.
He's learning how to socialize, and he's 25. You wouldn't know it if you saw him, but scared to death to go up to a male or a female, definitely female, and introduce himself or say hi, even in passing. And I would always ask him, what is the issue? He says, I just feel so anxious. And I said, so why is this any different than when you were younger? He says, when I was younger, I just played video games. I talked to all my friends online. I says, okay, so why is it different now? He says, and he clear as day, he says, I don't know what to say. Now, that doesn't sound very profound right now, because most people would say just walk up and say hi. But you don't know what it takes for someone who doesn't have the skill set and the confidence or the history of socializing with people and just walking up and saying hi, to now go out as 20-something years old to a female and say, hey, how you doing? My name is such and such. They are very fearful to do that, almost scared to death.
Right. And so let's transition. And I know we're moving through these, and anybody can research this stuff. And I'll say this again: video games in and of itself is not a bad thing. But
Correct.
when you allow your child, or you see even young adults and adults excessively playing video games and indulging in it, and everything else in life becomes secondary, we have a problem, right? So let's talk real quick about relationship issues. Here's what and we'll go over all the relationship issues. However,
Okay.
what I find interesting, and I started having to do in my practice, when kids say my friends, I then now have to ask, are we talking real life or virtual? The majority of these kids that we see that have these mental health issues, all of their friends are virtual. Some of them they never even met.
Oh, that's very true. That's very true. I can say I've worked with individuals who are adolescents that said their best friends were actually online. I had a young female patient. She's now think she must be now what, probably 20. When I met her, she was 16. Her best friend that she said she grew up with was overseas.
Right.
And she never met him in person.
Right. So let's talk about the relationship issues, because we talked about isolation, disconnected from the family, disconnected from friends, disconnected from community, and so forth. What are some of the relationship issues, not to mention because of the lack of motivation, the emotional outbursts, and all those things, it becomes a strain on peer-to-peer relationships, mother or parent-to-child relationships, and so forth. Talk about that. So,
Well, I'll talk about this factor. This is something I've seen constantly in my practice. They actually have a desire, or excuse me, a lack of desire to establish relationships.
right.
They don't. I mean, all they have to do is go in the room and play a video game, and or just stay in the room. Period. There's no real desire to go out and socialize. But when you talk about interpersonal relationships, you're talking about dialogue. You're talking about emotional intimacy, psychological intimacy, and maybe physical intimacy. An individual has to have those skills in terms of experience as well as motivation, which you mentioned earlier, to be even willing to step out on a branch and do that.
Right.
And when they've never had those opportunities, when they present themselves, they're going to be too afraid or too taken aback to even take that initiative to do that, let alone have the history and the skill set to do it in the first place.
And another thing that I see is a lot of social anxiety. Explain what social anxiety is.
In a nutshell, social anxiety is just basically you have a fear of or a lack of motivation to go out and integrate yourself with others. That's even peers at school, people in your neighborhood. Believe it or not, that kind of anxiety relates to the family, because your family is part of society. Your family is social. If you weren't really connected to the family network, sometimes these kids eat in their rooms these days. It's not like it didn't happen back in the day, but along with this incline of video games, they eat in the room, they sleep in the room, they drink in there, everything stays in the room. So you just disconnect yourself socially. And when you do that, when people try to socialize with you, you don't have that familial time. You don't have that familiar outlet. You don't have that familiar skill set. Therefore, you do it the way you do it. And since you don't have a history of doing it, a lot of these kids, you'll see them walk around with their head down, or maybe a hood over their head a little bit. They get to where they're going, and that's it.
Right. And it's funny because people begin to isolate themselves. But then here's the pattern that I see. They begin to isolate themselves. Then their friends and their family goes on with their life.
Correct.
And they say, I have no friends. I'm not connected. So they further isolate, which further reinforces that will to isolate. And then I have no friends. I have no relationships. And
Correct.
we become more and more socially disconnected.
Right. Well, that's a cyclical process I talked about earlier. When you don't have the skill set to do it, you lose the motivation because you feel inferior, insecure. Since you don't have that security, you don't do it. Therefore, it doesn't get done. You feel more insecure, and it goes and it goes and it goes and it cycles.
Right. So let's move on, which I find interesting, is a exposure to toxic gaming environments, especially for people who already are emotionally fragile, whether it's kids being mean, whether it's being exposed, especially at an early age, exposed to killing and sex and bullying and all that stuff. Talk about that some.
Well, some of these environments, and not all of them, and some of the environments in some of the games, it caters to that. There's some games, and the games aren't necessarily bad. The game just has a content. But if for example, myself as an individual who's angry and frustrated and wish I just wanted to beat somebody up, I can find a game where I can do that connects with those type of emotions with me, and ends up having that kind of reaction within my body system with like we talked about the dopamine and everything. That I get to interact with that game, what I want to interact with socially. So I don't have to go outside and necessarily fight anybody. I can spend my time isolated in my room and get my feelings out. And then a parent might say, my kid is upset. I see my kid irritable. I see my kid frustrated. And the kid might say to you, no, I'm not. And you know what? They're not being not untruthful. They're not, because they got their needs met in that game. But whenever they feel a certain way, they're going to take it out in that game.
Right. But what about for those who take those gaming and the things that people say to heart when it gets to
Hmm.
the point of bullying, being upset, and even get to the point where people want to engage in self-harm.
Well, that's sadly enough, it's not far fetched for those people to act out against others or even against themselves. Because
Right.
one thing about what you talked about earlier, one thing about these video games is it's monodirectional. I can only give to the video game, but it's not going to give back to me anything different. It's going to give to me the same thing every time.
Right.
Therefore, I'm not learning anything from it.
Right. And so I do want to say this. I've seen, because a lot of kids come in and they playing Roblox, Minecraft, and all these things. Some of those games are teaching real skill sets. Some of
Hmm.
those games are really, I think, on the are innocent in the sense that they do have value. So it's the once it's the environment and it's the excessiveness of it and the addiction to it that creates the problem. So I've seen some of the games because, as you know, with doing children's therapy, we got to
Yeah,
learn their language, right?
correct. Right.
So even if I got to be familiar with Roblox and Minecraft and things like that, just to be able to communicate with them. And I
Hmm.
look at some of those things, they're not inherently bad,
No, you're right.
but yet again, it's the excessiveness of it. Now let's talk to this one real quick. But there's two more, and we'll begin to wrap this up. Poor academic performance or professional performance. We could go all day about that. But what are
Yeah.
some of the things that you see? And I know we saw a lot of it with the temptation of being on social, what is it called? Distance learning. And you have a laptop, you have a tablet, and then you have the temptation of video games. But even out of distant learning, what are the risks for academic performance?
Well, just getting in. If an individual is entrenched in these games, like taking for example COVID, I've actually had a lot of teachers uh, in my practice over the last few years, just in practice in general, but especially over COVID. And one of the things they've complained about the most is it's so difficult to teach these kids because they're not motivated at all to be on the computer in the classroom. Some of these teachers have told me when the kids online with the computer for class, they can see them playing video games on the TV
Right.
behind the screen. I mean, they have to turn their back actually to the screen and actually play a video game. And their grades over COVID, I mean, it had something to do, I'm sure, with not being in the classroom. The lack of face-to-face interaction with the teacher, the lack of face-to-face interaction with peers, the lack of a consistent and structured schedule academically. But at the same time, not putting forth their effort, not having the motivation, not having the desire, not having the guidance, maybe at home, definitely not having the self implied structure of themselves to be able to focus and initiate their task and start it to finish. Their
Right.
academics are definitely going to suffer. Their grades are going to drop for sure because
Right.
they haven't put forth the performance.
But also when it comes to the the pace of studying, the pace of reading, the pace of doing math, it's not as automatic as video games and things like that. And not to mention, I spend too much time on video games
Yeah.
versus the time on studying or work. Oh, our performance dips.
Oh yeah. No, you're exactly right. You're exactly right.
Right. Now here's one, the final one that we'll talk about, and then we'll talk about some other things real quick, is, and I see this with adults and children, and it's funny because how are children, adolescents, and young adults the escapism and getting stuck in life? That's amazing. And it's funny. I had a client who told me that I'm trying to manage the stress of life and figure things out, and I feel stuck. Literally, he used those terms, and he's 12.
Wow.
12.
Wow.
And my thought was, okay, so your mom feeds you, your mom pays the bills, but you're trying to manage the stress of life. What are we talking about? And when it comes to the video games,
Mm-hmm.
and because see, here's the thing, believe it or not, kids, people begin to dream, begin to see themselves in this profession, see themselves and go in this direction. And it may change 1,000 times, but that's how we learn who we are. But if
Correct.
I'm not exploring anything, if I'm not exploring the world, I'm going to get stuck. Talk about that.
Well, I completely agree, but when you really look at it even deeper, you're going to get stuck, and you're actually stuck in nothingness.
Right.
You don't even know you're stuck or where you're stuck at because you just haven't moved. And
Haven't moved at all.
you haven't moved because you don't have the experience to move, you have the knowledge base to move, you don't even have the motivation, but you do feel different, you do feel odd, and you do feel like you don't fit in. But where's your history of socializing? Where's your history of taking some risks? Go try to play a sport, go try to join a club, and maybe you make it and maybe you don't. Where's
Right.
that resiliency that we talked about earlier, where you maybe try to achieve something and you make it, or you maybe try to achieve something and you fail? Where's that resiliency? That young man probably didn't have it. So when he says stuck, now he probably sits back and says, man, okay, I'm 12. I'm going to whatever grade I'm going to. What am I going to do when I get there? What's it going to be like? What are the people going to be like? I'm not even sure if I can do it. And
Right.
like you said, where is mom? Where is dad? But when they go to talk to him, what are you going to offer him? Okay,
Right.
son, this is how you're supposed to do it. Or daughter, this is how you're supposed to do it. Well, okay, fine. I'm supposed to do it that way, but I've never done it. So you basically sending me outside to go to ride a bike for the first time by myself with no training wheels. That's a little scary.
Right. And what I see is a lot of young adults, high schoolers graduating from high school, young college people who are struggling with that transition for this
Mm-hmm.
very reason,
Mm-hmm.
because they don't have the skill set, and then they realize, oh wow, life isn't a video
That's right. And
game.
oftentimes what you'll hear in these cases too is you'll hear people say things like, this isn't fair.
I see that.
And I always say to them, I always say this, do me a favor, tell me what the rules are.
Right.
So if you don't know the rules, you can't tell me what's fair because you don't even know what the rules are.
Because they're playing by the rules of the universe that they've created for themselves.
Which is if they're not careful, which can lead to a universe of isolation of just themselves.
Right. Absolutely.
And
So
instant gratification.
so let's do this. Let's turn the page a little bit.
Okay.
This is not to bash video games. There's value. We're talking excessive, addictive use of video games, especially on kids. Now let's give some pointers of what parents or what people should do in reference to two things. For people who are not at this point yet, what should they do? And for kids or people who are at this point, what do we suggest? I'll let you start.
Well, I'll say this for people who aren't at this point, I would say definitely, look around socially, look at yourselves, how you grew up, look at your kids, how they're growing up, and do some research on this. Look it up. Look up the ill effects of it, but don't globalize it. But if you notice that your kid is becoming more and more entrenched in it, get them involved in something socially. And again, I know we went through COVID for the last year and a half. That's a utopian perspective of it to give that answer for that. But get them involved in something socially. Find out who their friends are. Let them have some time with their friends. Get them on a sport team. Get them in a club if they can. If they're doing something like that. If they got relatives, invite the relatives over for sleepover. When it's not COVID. Just get them socializing on something other than the video games, so they don't end up doing it. But at the same time, give them the video games maybe as an outlet. Maybe this is a motivator. If you clean up your room, I'll give you some game time, or you get some screen time. It can be a motivator for sure, because the games are fun, the games are interesting, the games are educational. I mean, I've worked with autistic kids who had social issues and emotional issues, and they really get into video games, but they've played some video games when I worked with them. They did some different games that really cater to the emotionality of it. It wasn't so much the negative aspects. It was, okay, well, why would somebody do that? Isn't that funny? Or did you think that was funny? Why did you think that was funny? Oh, I never encountered that before. So
Right.
that is a positive to it. Now, when we're talking about individuals who are at this stage of what we're discussing, I would say, listen, first things first, sit down with your kid and find out where your kid is emotionally, psychologically, and socially. And if they are not where you think they should be or where you want them to be, you need to make some changes. And some of
Right.
the changes are letting them know that that game time needs to be reduced. And above all else, first and foremost, family time needs to be increased. That's got to
Right.
be the start.
I'm gonna jump on that real quick. Something is taken away, you have to replace it with something else.
Correct.
So if you're going to minimize video game play, you have to replace that with something else, hopefully more productive and more positive, like family time, like time with mom and dad, and things like that. I always say kids need balance.
Mm-hmm.
So using video games as a reward, using it as an incentive, and
Correct.
things have to be done, but then also maybe on certain days there are no video games. It's family time. It's time to
There
go
you go.
outside. Sports day. On school days, if you say, okay, you know what? School nights, there's no video game play. Okay. Or school nights, it's you get 30, 40, whatever, but there has to be balance, and we have to get our kids and people involved in other things. So I'm not totally against video games, but what we're beginning to see more of is the negative effects, and these are the kids that are coming to us. So we can imagine the ones that don't make it to us, right?
Agreed.
And
Agreed.
and, and so for those who are at this point, understand it's an uphill battle because you're going through withdrawal, you're changing a behavior, there's some emotional regulation that needs to be going on, and getting back out socially and reconnecting is scary in this day and age because we're not used to it, especially as kids. So there are things that you can do, but at the same time, it's going to take work. And,
Yeah.
and here's the thing. I know, when the PS5 and all that stuff came out, you had kids getting it, you had the adults getting it, and that's fine. However, when it becomes anything, when it begins to interfere with your life and interfere with your daily functioning, it's a problem.
Agreed. Agreed.
So, any further thoughts on this topic?
No, I think it's pretty much covered. I think you hit the nail on the head. Anything in excess of a normal level of function is just an interaction. Just it's not going to be good for you in the long run.
Right. So I appreciate you joining me on this
Oh,
topic.
thanks for
Sometimes
having me.
I give my thoughts, and I think I'm smart, but to have both of us discussing it, I think is more cool because it's not just me. I do have a
Right.
bias when it comes to video games, and when parents come to me and they bring their kids, that's in my assessment, and I always ask about it, and then I give them feedback. I don't tell them what to do. I give them feedback. I give them information. So moving forward, let's real quick. I want to plug this group, um, Hearts of Men, as we begin to close out. So Hearts of Men every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock on Zoom. If you want to join us, I believe it's very beneficial. It's a good space to for us to talk about things. And so Jerome is my co-host or my co-facilitator. Well, I decided I'm the moderator. He's the facilitator. So talk about the group and how it's growing and what's the benefits of it.
I can tell you this: the group is amazing. We've been doing it for a little bit so far, but it's taken off. I think it's very productive for all the people who tend to come on to it because it gives us a platform to be able to share about anything. It's not meant to be a mental health therapy session group. It's actually a group where everybody just shows up and they have the chance to talk about if it's sports, it's social, it's relationships, it's the status of the country this particular time or has been for a long time, how we can make changes as people going forward, how much has the male changed over time? How much has the black male grown? What are some things we need to continue to do to grow? What are some ways we can work and teach and change our kids and prepare them for while we're here as well as when we're gone? All these topics are different things that we've discussed in the group, and we will continue to do so going forward. So I think the group is extremely beneficial, and I look forward to having most people, you know, come on eventually one at a time, groups at a time, like we already had people do in the past, and just keep it growing, just make it bigger and bigger and more productive.
Absolutely. And we're building a community together. We're moving forward
Mm-hmm.
together. So
Mm-hmm.
as we begin to wrap this up, don't forget you could check me out at Psychology Today, Instagram, Facebook, what's the other one? Twitter, and also a special event coming up on June 26th at 9 a.m. We will be joining the Sister Circle. Our group will join their group for a discussion for the Father's Day edition. You won't want to miss it. You can sign up on Eventbrite, and we're going to have a good time. So with that being said, again, to wrap this up, and I hope you learned something about how video games can affect our children when done in excess and when it becomes an addictive nature. So once again, I want to thank my partner, Jerome Washington, for joining me. And
Thanks
we're
for
going to
having
see
me.
you next week. And this has been Indestructible Souls, the podcast for mental wellness for men and boys. And guess what? We're out.
Good night.